Every mushroom grower has some idea about what they should focus on in their operation. The hard truth is that the most fundamental thing a mushroom operation must do is make more money than they spend. Period. The most common error I see with mushroom growers is that they lose sight of this reality. There's a marvelous line in the show Longmire where farmers, losing is a way of life. I've reflected on this again and again. When I think about Monster Creek mushrooms, I always consider us to be a mushroom company. Farms grow food, companies make money. The difference is staggering. If you're interested in starting a mushroom operation or upping your existing game, you probably don't have the luxury of focusing on high ideals first. If your operation isn't successful, you're not going to feed the world in an eco-friendly farm or make any difference in the world at all. If you don't make money, your dreams will be shattered and your effort will amount to nothing. So, where's the money in mushroom growing? Andrew summed up our philosophy of the importance of working backwards in a previous blog post. I recommend that if you haven't already read it. But the mushroom growing value chain looks about like this. At the very low end, you've got spores, but they're low value. Really, as far as gourmet mushrooms, you don't actually see those traded very much. Most cultures are just clones of wild strains, and they've been or have been bred some time ago, so you don't really worry about spores. Cultures, this can seem alluring because a little petri dish can sell for $30 to $100, but the effort behind the scenes is substantial. So companies that focus on culture development and retention tend to have infrastructure in place to handle it. And they justify that by volume sales. They usually also create spawn, which, by the way, is where the real value starts to come into play. There are substantially more legitimate spawn companies than companies that deal with anything further up the value chain. Now, this is a real niche. It relies heavily on other companies and farms buying the product to actually make the fresh mushrooms that feed the whole value chain. Now, beyond that, you've got fruiting blocks or grow bags, whatever you want to call them. To make them, you add spawn to the pasteurized substrate and then incubate it. Substrate's pretty cheap. Fruiting blocks are moderately valuable. So if you don't do this in-house, then shipping really ends up being the silent killer there. You also have fresh mushrooms. This is where the money is actually made. Everybody buys everything else in the whole chain for the mushrooms that they make. Also, you got to think about distribution, because if the mushrooms don't get sold, then they quickly become worthless mush. When you're first starting out, you really don't have the option of letting somebody else sell your product. We'll get into that another day, though. The largest single increase in value in the mushroom growing chain, as far as per pound of mushroom, is turning fruiting blocks into fresh mushrooms, at least in the beginning. At some point, you need to start making your own blocks, because this is the second largest increase in the value chain, and it allows you to cut out the shipping costs on heavy and bulky product. So the 80-20 rule says that the first 80% of results only takes the first 20% of effort, but the remaining 20% of results takes 80% of effort. When you've got a system in place that can transform raw materials and spawn coming in to fresh mushrooms that you can sell, then you've reached that magical 20% where the value of your investment is maximized relative to the value you export. However, there is a trap in this transition. You'll face it again and again as you level up, and that's the allure of looking legitimate. There's an endless number of fancy gadgets and equipment to waste money on, and they're all wrong. To be clear, we're all doing this wrong. If you watch any of the mushroom videos on YouTube, you'll see an endless variety of ways things can be done wrong. Whatever you start with, though, it's going to be wrong too, and that's the trap. There's going to be a temptation to spend large amounts of money on some fancy equipment that somebody else has shown off for the bragging rights, and once you pick it up, then you are invested. There's generally no going back. I mean, you can resell it, but you're stuck with that expense, whether it was worth it or not. You should be heavily biased towards spending as little as possible until you have enough familiarity with your process to make decisions that are less bad. When we started working with the Masters Mix, we had a cement mixing tub and a pitchfork. We mixed it by hand. It was agonizing slow, and even though it beat working with straw, hands down, we knew that we were doing it wrong. I spent a lot of time thinking about this process and realized that we were mixing the bags twice. Once when we first mixed it prior to sterilizing, and then again when we mixed spawn in the lab. So I asked Andrew why we were doing this work all over again, and he didn't have a good answer. So I'd seen another grower adding dry ingredients to bags and then swishing them around by hand after adding the water. And we realized we could cut out half of our work for free, so we started scooping dry ingredients and adding the water without mixing at all until we put spawn in the lab. So after doing it wrong, really, really wrong, we learned what doing it right might look like, and in the end, when we made our current process, I built a prototype. That was the first Thor and the mousetrap. Just built it from stuff that we had lying around, and found that we had a system that could produce as well as a lot of the big expensive mechanized systems people had been using. Now, that prototype, Thor and the mousetrap, we used it for 2.5 years, I think, before it finally got retired and replaced by the new one. And that was just because it ended up working so well that it wasn't worth the trouble to replace. So even now, we're still doing it wrong, but we were able to do all of this without taking out a loan, and it works good enough. So the general principles that I just want to focus on are that you'll always do it wrong, especially when you're first starting. We're just trying to do things less wrong. Remember that cheap is better than expensive, simple is better than complex. If you're thinking about how excited you will be to show off your new tech, it's probably the wrong investment. Prioritize effective systems over expensive technology, and remember that good enough really is good enough.
Very good.